A feared and calculating head of a powerful crime syndicate receives a desperate call from a terrified child who dialed the wrong number. And he abandons his empire to become the silent guardian she needs, setting off a chain of events that forces him to honor a protective instinct he thought had died years ago. Osilio Mazzi, a ruthless leader who has spent 23 years ruling his syndicate with an iron fist, lives by the principle of emotional numbness. But one late night, his private line rings not with a business associate, but with the trembling voice of Hilda Merrill, a young child hiding from a violent intruder. Without hesitation, Osilio races through the city, driven by the echo of his own past trauma, where he once failed to protect those he loved. What he discovers inside that house will dismantle his carefully constructed walls and transform him into an anonymous protector for the very family that reached him by mistake. Osilio Mazzi sat in an office that served as a cathedral of silent power, perched high above the city where the lights below looked like distant, shimmering embers. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of polished mahogany and the weight of a man who moved the world with a whisper. Osilio sat behind a desk of dark wood, his posture a study in restrained intensity. He was the head of a syndicate built on the ruins of Michael Rodriguez, the identity he had buried 25 years ago in the same grave as his innocence. For over 2 decades, he had lived by a singular, frigid code: trust no one, love nothing, and feel absolutely nothing. Every decision he made was a surgical calculation, a move on a chessboard where people were merely pieces to be sacrificed for the expansion of his territory. His reputation was carved from a history of blood and betrayal, a legacy so cold that his name alone could silence a room full of the city's most hardened criminals. He had become a system of his own making, a mountain of iron and Italian leather that no law could touch and no emotion could penetrate. Tonight, the office was particularly still, the only sound being the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of a clock. Osilio stared intently at his phone, his serious expression conveying a mind that was always 3 steps ahead of his enemies. He was a man who had replaced his heart with a clockwork mechanism of profit margins and power plays. To the world, he was an enigma, a boss figure who ruled with an iron fist. He believed he had successfully erased the boy who once read bedtime stories and made dinners in a cramped apartment. He believed Michael was truly gone. The lighting in a room was warm and amber, reflecting off the polished surface of his desk, but did nothing to soften the chill that emanated from the man himself. He was a predator at rest, a figure of deliberate decision-making who had long ago decided that caring was a luxury he could no longer afford. The world outside his window was a chaotic sprawl, but within these 4 walls, Osilio Mazzi was the absolute master of his fate. He had built a throne of glass, beautiful, sharp, and transparently cold, and he intended to sit upon it until the end. The heavy silence of the office was punctured by a sound that didn't belong, a sharp, insistent ring from the private phone resting on the mahogany desk. Osilio Mazzi did not flinch, but his eyes narrowed as he stared at the screen. This line was a ghost, reserved for a handful of people who knew better than to call unless the world was ending. He answered with a cold, clipped silence, waiting for a voice of authority or a threat to manifest. Instead, what came through the speaker was a jagged, terrified sob. "Please," a voice whispered, so small and fragile it seemed to vibrate with the chill of a winter wind. "He's in the house. He's going to hurt us." Osilio's grip on the phone tightened. This wasn't a business associate or a rival. It was a child. He looked at the unknown number, his mind cataloging the error instantly. A wrong digit, a desperate scramble in the dark, and a little girl had reached the most dangerous man in Boston instead of the police. "Who is this?" Osilio asked. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of warmth, yet it lacked the lethal edge he usually reserved for his enemies. "I'm Hilda." The voice trembled, followed by the muffled sound of something heavy crashing in the distance. I'm hiding in the chair, but I can hear him. He's beating my mama. Please, you have to come. For the first time in 23 years, the ironclad certainty that governed Osilio's life flickered. He was a man who lived by the rule of calculated indifference. Yet this child's voice acted like a physical blow to his chest. It echoed with a frequency he had spent decades trying to mute. The sound of a sister's desperation, of a promise made in a hospital room that he had buried under mountains of power and blood. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor like a harsh exhale. His men, stationed outside the heavy doors, froze as he stepped out, his coat already in hand. They saw a look on his face that none of them recognized: uncertainty. It wasn't the hesitation of a weak man, but the turbulent awakening of a ghost. He didn't offer an explanation as he strode toward the elevator. He didn't need to. Something in Hilda's trembling plea had reached past Osilio Mazzi and grabbed Michael Rodriguez by the throat. "Stay on the line, Hilda," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of command that was strangely protective. "Don't hang up. I'm on my way." As the elevator doors slid shut, the cold master of the Syndicate disappeared, replaced by a man racing toward a crisis he couldn't control with money or fear alone. The tires of the armored sedan shrieked against the pavement as Osilio tore out of the parking garage, the engines roar a primal scream that mirrored the sudden turbulence in his chest. He drove with a reckless precision that defied the physics of the quiet neighborhood, his knuckles turning white as he clenched the steering wheel. Outside the reinforced glass, the city was a smear of darkness and motion, where the streetlights blurred past like golden bullets fired into the night. He had navigated these streets thousands of times to secure territory or finalize deals, but he had never driven them with the weight of genuine fear crushing his lungs. His phone sat open on the passenger seat, the line to Hilda still active, capturing the terrifying symphony of a house under siege. Each time the child whimpered or a muffled crash echoed through the speaker, Osilio pressed the accelerator harder, the needle on the speedometer climbing into territory he usually reserved for escapes. The GPS announced the remaining minutes, a countdown that felt like a trial. 12 minutes. 5 minutes. 1 minute. To the world, Osilio Mazzi was a man of infinite patience and calculated moves, but in the cockpit of the roaring car, he was Michael Rodriguez again, a brother failing to run fast enough, a protector arriving too late. The memory of Isabella's small, fragile hand in the hospital bed flickered in his mind, her final squeeze a ghost pain that urged him forward. As he neared the address, the flickering movement of shadows against drawn curtains came into view, the house standing isolated and dark under a broken porch light. He didn't wait for the car to fully settle before he was out the door, the cold night air hitting his face like a wake-up call. Tonight, he wasn't arriving as the boss of a criminal empire. He was arriving as the only hope a little girl had left. The golden bullets of the streetlights were behind him now, replaced by the grim reality of a front door standing slightly ajar. 25 years ago, Osilio Mazzi had been a different man entirely, known then by his birth name, Michael Rodriguez. He lived in a cramped apartment with his younger sister, Isabella, and their mother, Carmen. They were poor, but they were happy, and Michael spent his days taking care of Isabella after school, helping her with homework and tucking her into bed with stories about brave knights and rescued princesses. Isabella was only 8 years old, with dark curls that bounced when she laughed and a smile that could light up their tiny kitchen on even the coldest winter mornings. She believed her big brother could fix anything, solve any problem, and chase away any monster hiding under her bed. The nightmare that would forever change his life began on a Thursday evening in November while Michael was working his part-time job at a local garage. A phone call came from a police officer informing him that there had been a domestic dispute in the unit next door to their apartment. The violence escalated and shots were fired through the thin walls of the building. Carmen, and Isabella had been caught in the crossfire. Michael dropped everything and ran through the streets, which suddenly felt foreign and hostile, as if every corner he passed was a tombstone marking the death of his old life. When he reached the hospital, the fluorescent lights felt like interrogation lamps, exposing every failure and every moment he hadn't been there to protect them. His mother survived with minor injuries, but Isabella did not. Michael held his little sister's hand as medical machines beeped around them like mechanical heartbeats counting down to silence. She looked so small and fragile in that hospital bed, like a butterfly with broken wings. Before the machines went quiet, Isabella squeezed his hand one last time and whispered her final words. "Mikey, promise me you'll help other kids when they're scared." Something fundamental shifted inside him after the funeral. The part of him that believed in justice and the possibility that good people could live safe lives died with his sister. He realized the police couldn't protect his family, and the system had failed everyone he loved. What emerged from that grief was Osilio Mazzi, a man colder, harder, and more calculating than Michael Rodriguez could ever be. He decided to become the system himself, starting small by running numbers and eventually transforming into a feared enforcer who controlled the city's waterfront. He spent 25 years building walls around his heart so thick that nothing could penetrate them, convincing himself that caring about anyone was a luxury he could no longer afford. He built a throne of glass, beautiful and transparently cold, and intended to sit upon it until the end. But as he arrived at the address provided by Hilda, the cold weight of that 25-year-old promise finally shattered his carefully constructed isolation. He realized that tonight, he was not arriving as a mafia boss. He was arriving as the only hope that a little girl had left, finally honoring the vow he made to the sister he couldn't save. The front door of the modest, two-story house hung slightly ajar, a jagged mouth of darkness that seemed to swallow the flickering, sickly yellow glow of a broken porch light. Osilio Mazzi stepped out of his armored sedan, the engine still ticking as it cooled in the crisp, indifferent night air. He adjusted his silk jacket, feeling the cold, familiar weight of the weapon holstered at his side, a tool of his trade that felt fundamentally different tonight. Usually, it was a means of expansion or a signature of his authority. Tonight, it was a shield. As he crossed the threshold, the silence of the suburban neighborhood was replaced by the muffled, ugly sounds of visceral violence, the heavy crash of breaking furniture and a woman's pleading, ragged voice. Inside, the house reeked of stale beer and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. Osilio moved through the shadows with the silent, predatory grace of a man who had spent more than 2 decades hunting in the dark. He was a creature of polished boardrooms and blood-stained warehouses, but this domestic setting felt like a foreign planet. The living room was a disaster zone, a chaotic landscape of overturned chairs, shattered picture frames, and the remnants of a life being torn apart. In the center of the wreckage lay a woman, her blonde hair matted with red, her breathing shallow and labored. Osilio knelt beside her, checking her pulse with a gentle touch that felt alien to his calloused hands, a ghost of the tenderness he had once shown Isabella when she had fever. Then he saw her. Hilda stood at the bottom of the stairs, a small, trembling figure in a soft pink dress that looked impossibly bright and pure against the grime of the hallway. Her eyes were wide, filled with a hollow terror that no child should ever have to witness, her small hands still clutching the phone like a lifeline. The contrast was a physical blow to Osilio's chest. Here was the ultimate innocence, unprotected and fragile, standing in the middle of a nightmare he had spent 25 years trying to bury under layers of iron and leather. She was a living mirror to the sister he had lost, a haunting reminder of the night his world ended. The heavy, uneven footsteps of the intruder thundered from the floor above, a man's voice slurred with alcohol and blind rage calling out threats that made Osilio's jaw clench with lethal intent. The intruder's world was one of petty, cowardly cruelty, while Osilio's world was built on calculated, absolute power. The two were about to collide in a way that would leave no room for negotiation. Hilda looked up at him, her gaze locking onto his serious, shadowed face. For a fleeting second, the expensive suit, the legendary reputation, and the aura of menace he carried didn't matter. She didn't see a Mafia boss or a monster. She saw the stranger who had actually answered the phone. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thumping of his own heart. In that moment, the throne of glass Osilio had built around himself. The one he thought was impenetrable didn't just crack. It vanished. The cold, mechanical logic he had lived by for 25 years was incinerated by the simple gratitude of a terrified child. He was no longer just Osilio Mazzi, the man who moved the world with a whisper. He was a protector who had finally arrived at the right door, 25 years too late, but with the power to ensure this ending was different. The thundering footsteps above stopped at the top of the landing, followed by the heavy, metallic click of a hammer being pulled back. Osilio didn't flinch. To a man who had stared down federal agents and rival kingpins, the sound of a cheap revolver in the hands of a coward held no weight. He looked at Hilda one last time, his expression softening for a fraction of a second, a silent command for her to close her eyes, before he stepped into the light of the hallway. The man who stumbled into view was a hollowed-out shell of a human being, his eyes bloodshot and frantic, his clothes stained with the same beer that poisoned his breath. He was the kind of monster Osilio usually ignored, a small-time predator who feasted on the vulnerable because he lacked the spine to face an equal. In the Syndicate, violence was a currency, a cold and calculated tool used to balance ledgers or send messages. But as Osilio looked at the bruises on the woman's face and the way Hilda shrank into the shadows, he realized this was a different kind of violence entirely. This was a senseless, chaotic cruelty that served no purpose other than to destroy what was beautiful. "Who the hell are you?" the man spat, his hands shaking as he leveled the gun at Osilio's chest. Osilio didn't answer with words. He moved with a speed that made the air itself seem to fracture. Before the man could even register the shift in the room, Osilio was upon him. He didn't draw his own weapon. He didn't need it. He caught the man's wrist in a grip that crushed bone like dry kindling, forcing the muzzle of the revolver toward the ceiling. A single, muffled shot went wide, burying itself in the plaster, but the sound was quickly drowned out by the intruder's scream of agony. Osilio's strike was a study in absolute efficiency. He drove a knee into the man's ribs, the sound of snapping cartilage echoing through the small house like the breaking of a debt. This wasn't the surgical execution of a business rival. This was a cleansing. For every night Michael Rodriguez had woken up screaming from the memory of Isabella, he poured that banked-up rage into the man before him. He saw the face of every bully, every corrupt officer, and every shadow that had ever haunted his family's doorstep. He didn't kill the man, not out of mercy, but because death was too quick a release for someone who had made a child feel that small. Instead, he systematically dismantled him, neutralizing the threat with a cold, terrifying precision that left the intruder incapacitated and sobbing on the floor. When the man was finally a heap of broken pride and shattered limbs, Osilio stood over him, not a single hair out of place, his breathing as calm as the surface of a frozen lake. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, wiping a single drop of blood from his cuff with the same meticulous care he used to sign a multi-million-dollar contract. He looked down at the pathetic creature at his feet and realized that in the hierarchy of the world, he was a god compared to this worm. Yet, for the first time in 25 years, he felt the stirrings of a soul he thought he had traded for a throne of glass. He turned his back on the monster, leaving him to the darkness, and walked back toward the girl in the pink dress. The chaos of the house began to settle into a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the woman on the floor and the pathetic, muffled groans of the man Osilio had broken. Osilio stood in the center of the room, a pillar of dark wool and absolute authority. He did not look at the intruder again. The man was no longer a factor, merely a piece of debris to be cleared away. Instead, he turned his full attention to the staircase, where Hilda still stood, her small frame trembling so violently that the phone in her hand rattled against the wood of the banister. "It's over, Hilda," he said. His voice was no longer the sharp blade of a syndicate boss. It was low, steady, and carried a weight of certainty that seemed to anchor the air in the room. He walked toward her mother, kneeling once more in the wreckage. He didn't wait for permission. He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from the woman's bruised forehead. "I have people coming," he whispered to her. "The best doctors. You're going to be safe. Both of you." Hilda finally moved, her feet hitting the carpeted steps in a hesitant rhythm until she was standing just a few feet away. She looked at her mother, then at the towering man who had appeared out of the night like a dark angel. Osilio stood up and looked down at her. For a man who had spent 25 years avoiding the gaze of the innocent, he did not flinch. He saw the questions in her eyes, the fear that this safety was temporary, that the monster on the floor would return when the lights went out. "Listen to me very carefully," Osilio said, his voice dropping into a tone that commanded the universe to listen. "My name is Osilio Mazzi. In this city, that name is a law. It means that from this moment forward, no one will ever lay a finger on you or your mother again. Not him, and not anyone like him." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, embossed card, black with a simple gold crest. He didn't give it to her to use. He gave it to her as a talisman. "If anyone ever makes you feel afraid again, you show them this. Or you call that number. I will answer." He felt a strange, burning sensation in his chest. A phantom pain from heart he thought he had successfully replaced with clockwork. He wasn't just making a promise to a stranger. He was finally fulfilling the vow he had made to Isabella in that sterile hospital room. He was the man who could move mountains, who could silence entire city blocks with a single phone call. And for the first time, that power didn't feel like a burden or a sin. It felt like a purpose. Moments later, the street outside was flooded with the silent, flashing lights of black SUVs. These weren't the police. They were his personal detail, men who operated with a quiet, lethal efficiency that no public precinct could match. They entered the house without a word, two of them gently lifting Hilda's mother onto a stretcher, while others stepped toward the intruder to ensure he would be processed far away from the eyes of a child. Osilio didn't have to give orders. They knew the look in his eyes. This wasn't business. This was a debt of the soul. As he walked Hilda toward the waiting car, the streetlights above no longer looked like golden bullets. They were just lights, steady and warm, illuminating a path out of the dark. He looked at the girl in the pink dress, now wrapped in his own heavy overcoat, and made a silent vow to the ghost of Michael Rodriguez. The throne of glass was gone, and in its place was something far more dangerous to his enemies, a man who had found something worth protecting. The high-rise office was just as Osilio had left it, a cathedral of mahogany and amber light, but the man who returned to it was a stranger to the one who had walked out hours before. The rhythmic ticking of the clock no longer sounded like a countdown of profit margins. It sounded like a heartbeat. He sat behind the massive desk, but he didn't reach for the ledgers or the encrypted phones that managed his territory. Instead, he pulled a single, unlined sheet of paper from a drawer and began to write. To serve the light was a concept Osilio Mazzi had long ago discarded as a weakness of the naive. He had built his empire on the shadows, believing that power was only pure when it was cold. But the image of the pink dress against the grime of that hallway wouldn't leave him. He realized that the vast infrastructure he had created, the offshore accounts, the legal loopholes, the silent influence over the city's elite, was a weapon. For 25 years, he had used that weapon to grow his shadow. Now, he would use it to build a fortress for those the world had forgotten. With a few keystrokes and a secure call to his most trusted attorney, the Isabella Foundation was born. It was an anonymous trust fund, shielded by so many layers of corporate camouflage that even the federal government couldn't trace its origin. It was designed to act as a silent guardian for Hilda and her mother, providing them with a new home, the best medical care, and an education that would ensure the girl would never have to hide in the dark again. But it went further. The trust was structured to hunt for other wrong numbers, to intercept the cries for help that the traditional systems were too slow or too broken to hear. Osilio looked out at the city below. The shimmering embers of the streetlights no longer felt like distant targets. He understood now that he could never truly be Michael Rodriguez again. The blood on his hands was too deep for a simple rebirth. But he could be something else, a shadow protector. He would continue to rule his empire with an iron fist, but the gold it produced would no longer just buy loyalty or silence. It would buy safety for the innocent. He was still the master of his fate, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he was sitting on a throne of glass. He felt like he was standing on solid ground. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the skyline in hues of bruised purple and gold, Osilio closed his eyes. The mechanical ticking of the clock finally faded into the background, replaced by a memory of a small hand squeezing his own. He had kept his promise. The silence in the office was no longer heavy with the weight of buried secrets. It was finally, for the first time in a quarter century, peaceful. 6 months had passed since the night the telephone had bridged two worlds that never should have met. The city of Boston remained the same sprawling maze of steel and ambition, but for Osilio Mazzi, the landscape had fundamentally shifted. He still sat in his high-rise office, and the scent of polished mahogany still hung heavy in the air, but the cold, suffocating silence of his cathedral of power had been replaced by a quiet, purposeful home. He was no longer just a man maintaining a system of fear. He was a man maintaining a vigil. He had learned that power was not just measured by what one could take, but by what one had the strength to leave alone. In a quiet suburb miles away from the docks and the warehouses of the Syndicate, a small house with a freshly painted porch stood under the shade of ancient oaks. There, Hilda Meryl lived a life that was no longer defined by the shadows. Her mother had recovered, her eyes no longer darting to the corners of the room in search of a threat, and Hilda herself had returned to the simple joys of childhood. She attended a school where the teachers spoke of her brilliance, her tuition paid by a scholarship from a foundation whose origins were a mystery to everyone but the man who had signed the checks in the dead of night. Osilio watched her occasionally from the tinted windows of his sedan, parked at a distance that ensured his world would never touch hers again. He saw her running across the lawn, the pink dress replaced by a bright yellow sunflower print, her laughter a sound that reached through the glass and settled the restless ghosts in his mind. He didn't need her to know his face or remember his name. It was enough to know that she was thriving. To the world, he remained the enigma, the iron-fisted boss who ruled the city's underbelly. But within the walls of his own heart, the identity of Michael Rodriguez was no longer a buried corpse. It was a living part of him, a moral compass that had finally been recalibrated. The Isabella Foundation had grown into a silent, efficient machine, a network of shadow protectors who intervened when the light was too dim to see. Osilio had discovered that his skills in intelligence, logistics, and intimidation could be wielded with surgical precision to protect the vulnerable. He was still a predator, but he had chosen his prey more wisely, focusing his lethal intent on the monsters who thrived on the suffering of those who had no voice. He had found a way back to the person he was meant to be, not by erasing the scars of the last 25 years, but by using them as armor for others. As the sun began to set over the harbor, casting long, amber shadows across his desk. Osilio reached into his drawer and pulled out an old, faded photograph of a young girl with dark curls. He didn't hide it away this time. He placed it in a silver frame and set it next to his phones. He was no longer sitting on a throne of glass, waiting for the inevitable strike that would shatter his world. He had built something sturdier, something rooted in the promise he had kept. The ice that had encased his soul for a quarter-century had finally thawed, leaving behind a man who was dangerous, yes, but also, for the first time in his life, truly free.